Chairman, I can confirm the meeting is now live.
Okay, thank you. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Overview and Scrutiny Commission meeting this evening. First of all, as is the normal process, can I ask members to mute and turn off their video and to only do that when they wish to speak and indicate so through the chat to me, so as I know that you wish to speak, and then I can ask you in turn. Okay, thank you. I'd also like to welcome, apart from the members, our executive member, Chris Turrell, responsible with his portfolio for planning. We did invite Councillor Dudley, who's going to come along, but unfortunately he's got a fire service meeting that he chairs, so unfortunately he won't be here. We've also got a number of other people. We've got our Andrew Hunter, our director, Kevin Gibbs, our director, Andrew Jones from BPS, and Andrew will be telling you more about the people with him tonight, and Jim Bailey, who's a representative from Pegasus Planning, who will be telling us, I hope, about the developer side of things when we get to item 6. So first off then, if we may, is item 1 on the agenda, which is apologies for absence.
Hello, Chairman. Yes, I've received apologies from Councillor Mrs. Mackenzie Boyle.
Thank you. Are there any others from members?
Sorry, none that I'm aware of.
Okay.
I think there's one from, sorry, Mr. Chairman, I think there's one from Tina Mackenzie Ball. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah, that's the one that's just been mentioned.
I'm so sorry, I'll keep up soon.
Okay. For those, just for the benefit, of course, for those that are watching this evening, when we speak, can we put our name forward so as people know who's talking? So I'm Councillor Angel and Chairman of the Overview and Scrutiny Commission. And perhaps as we go through, when we take the roll call. Kirsty, if you would like to take the roll call of those present.
Thank you, Chairman. Councillor Angel.
Present.
Councillor Mrs. Birch.
Present.
Councillor Brossard.
Present.
Councillor Badebo. Councillor McLean.
Present.
Councillor Mrs. Mattick.
Present.
Councillor Mossam.
Present.
Councillor Porter.
Present.
Councillor Temperton.
Present.
Councillor Tullett.
Present.
Councillor Virgo.
Present.
Our parent governor representatives, Tracy Wright.
Present.
And Mark Glanville.
Present.
I'm aware of some other members being present, Chair. Is it okay to go through those as well?
Yes, please.
Thank you. So, Councillor Leake.
Present.
Councillor Gore.
Present.
Councillor Hayden.
Present.
Councillor Mrs. Hayes.
Present.
I'm sorry, Councillor Turrell.
Present.
Thank you. Is there anybody that I've missed?
Yes, Councillor Badebo present.
Oh, lovely. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We'll then move on to item 2, minutes of the meeting on the 6th of January. First of all, for accuracy, does anybody wish to make any comment? No? Then can I mention that when we move later on the agenda, we take an update on the work programme, I would ask Councillor Virgo to give an update on the climate change that he's been so kindly chairing. Okay, so I would now like members to take agreement or otherwise on the minutes of the 6th of January. Does anybody disagree? I see nothing in the chat, so therefore I take that as being accepted. Move on to item 3, declarations of interest and the party whip. I think we're all familiar with that, and I'm certainly not going to read that whole 3 paragraphs out. So I'll move that. Are there any? Any declarations of interest? Nobody is showing, so thank you. There are none. Item number 4 is urgent items of business. I'm not aware of any. Kirsty, are you aware of any?
Chair, no, I've not been notified of any.
Right, so there are none. Public participation? Any submissions? I'm not aware of any.
No, none were submitted to our committee Dropbox. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Then we move on to item 6, which is the scrutiny of planning practice. This really follows, can I say, in choosing this item, follows a very successful member development programme evening on the 26th of January about viability in the planning process. You'll see on the papers that what we're asked to discuss is, are our current planning practices robust enough to protect Bracknell Forest from developers manipulating viability study process? So I just point that out because we are not actually looking at the policy of affordable housing, which we know that is. That's not the subject matter, although it's linked with the conversation this evening. What I would like to do is to hand over to Andrew Hunter. Andrew, I understand you're going to present and introduce through this. And can I ask members to hold questions until we've finished going through the items and the presentations, and then we'll do questions at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Chairman. I'm Andrew Hunter. I'm Director here at Bracknell Forest for Place Planning and Regeneration. Also on the meeting tonight, I'm joined by Andrew Jones from BPS and Jim Bailey from Pegasus Planning. Both have got a background in either assessing viability assessments or working within the development industry and looking at the kind of the pushes and pulls about development viability and how you might use an assessment through the planning process. So I was going to do a short presentation just on the sort of the background, the national policy, the way in which it works at Bracknell Forest, and then I was just going to hand on to Andrew in the first place, just so that he could tell you a little bit about what he does and what he's been doing for the council, and then on to Jim, who might be able to just reflect a little bit on a developer's perspective, and then, as you say, take questions at the end. So I'll just share my screen. Can I just check that you can see those slides?
Yes, Andrew, I can.
Okay, lovely. So first of all, it's probably just worth reflecting on the government policy. So government planning policy set out in the National Planning Policy Framework. And what that says is where you've got an up-to-date local plan and your policies in it set out what expected contributions are, then compliant planning applications should be assumed to be viable. So your up-to-date plan will have been tested, and it's expected that when you apply that plan to development, that development should be viable. If a developer considers that not to be the case, then it's absolutely up to them as the applicant to justify the need for a viability assessment. And they would do that at the planning application stage. And members on this committee, and some of which who sit on our planning committee, will be aware of that. When we do receive a viability assessment, the weight that we give to that assessment is down to the decision maker. And in that generally in this circumstance, that's the local planning authority. And that will have regard to all parts and circumstances of that case, including whether our evidence is up to date, and any particular changes in site circumstances that might be different from what we tested through our local plan. So in terms of the kind of the more detailed policy guidance, that's set out in the planning policy guidance, and in your agenda pack, there's a link to their sort of the viability part of that. But the key point to stress is the role for viability assessment in the first place is primarily at the plan making stage. So local plan viability assessments, they're not there to compromise sustainable development, but they are there to ensure that our policies are realistic and cumulatively the cost of our policies do not undermine the plan delivery. So they're not so arduous and so financially punishing that you couldn't bring forward development. So when you're developing your local plan, you look at the viability of your plan as a whole to ensure that when it's adopted, you've got a position, you've tested the general types of development and you're clear that those should be found viable. Particular circumstances needed to justify a viability assessment at an application stage might be things like development that's not been tested through that viability assessment at the local plan process, or that there's very specific requirements of the site that make it unviable to develop without a viability assessment. And that might be that the infrastructure costs were unknown before the site was purchased, or site costs have emerged like contamination or something like that. You also might see viability assessments on non-standard market development, so things like private rent schemes, so they're not for sale. So sometimes there are some viability assessments around those. And obviously, if the economic circumstances of the country were to change, then that also can bring into bear the need for viability assessment. So after the financial crash in 2009, there certainly was a realization by government that there needed to be some viability work done on planning applications to enable them to come forward. Otherwise, they would have just sat and not been taken forward. So the NPPG, which is the National Planning Guidance, sets out the general inputs that you put to a viability assessment, and Andrew will be able to tell you more about these if you want to know more about them, but they're standard really. But what they look at is the gross development value and the costs associated with the viability, defined for the viability assessment, how land value is defined, so there are various ways in which you can do that, factors that they might consider it sort of benchmarking land values, looking at existing value in a viability assessment. You would look at the role of alternative uses to establish benchmark land value. Within that assessment, you would also think about the return that a developer might expect to get from a site. And normally that's between a sort of a 15 and 20% return. And that's what we would use in considering viability in the local plan context. And then how a viability assessment might apply to a different type of tenure, so a market rent option. So the guidance is quite clear, and so you should end up with reasonably standard assessments that come in through the planning process. So for Bracknell Forest, the key kind of planning costs for development are set out in community infrastructure levy. So that's a fixed amount of money in which developers are expected to contribute, depending on where they are located within the borough. Generally, it's associated with housing development. Not always, it depends on the locality. And that's normally a square metre cost. For the majority of our borough, the Thames Basin Heaths mitigation strategy applies to housing development. And again, that is a fixed cost. And then whatever's left, so generally sort of infrastructure in kind. So what I mean by in kind is when you're given land or works to a junction, things like that. Those come through the Section 106 along with affordable housing. So affordable housing often is the only thing that is left in the viability assessment, which is negotiable, because you can't negotiate the sill rate, you can't negotiate the Thames Basin Heath figure. So it's just important to point that out. Those things that you do collect through Section 106 are in the obligation supplementary planning document, which is again a link on the agenda. So since the introduction of sill, as I say, Section 106 agreements are largely deal with this in-kind provision and affordable housing, and actually that's where viability assessments generally focus. So any claims that a site cannot be developed viably with an affordable housing contribution must be justified, and that's got to be done clearly and in a robust way so that we can scrutinise that. And we do that through independent expert review. And if there is any relaxation in the provision of affordable housing for the purposes of viability, that should be at the very minimum level. So if 24, our current policy is 25% affordable housing on sites over 15 units. If the viability assessment suggests that 17% affordable housing is the amount that could be achieved on the site and give a viable development, then that's the minimum that we would accept. So we would expect it to be at that level of 17%, subject to it all being justified through that assessment. So the assessment process for planning applications is a bit of a busy slide, which I can simplify quite easily, but essentially, if a developer puts forward a planning application and believes that the site has some viability issues, when they submit that planning application, they will put in with it a viability assessment. That viability assessment is then checked by officers before it's validated. Once it's validated, we would obtain specialist advice on reviewing that assessment. And we've generally used the district valuers for that. We haven't always done that, but we've used the district valuers to assess that. Depending upon what the type of development is, you might seek someone different to do the assessment of the viability assessment if they've got more experience in that area. And essentially that assessment is then reviewed by the experts. They will either come back to us and say, actually, there's some issues within this assessment that don't seem to tally up and make sense. And you go into a process of negotiation and discussions with the developer about what those inputs and outputs are to make sure that they are true and a fair reflection of reality. And ultimately, you come to a conclusion using our experts as to whether the viability assessment is sound and robust, and then that has the knock-on implication for the planning application. And it's through that process that the decision as to whether the site delivers less affordable housing or not is made, and that's normally recommended through, generally on these sorts of schemes, through to the planning committee. So that's the kind of the process that happens. A couple of questions that we know have been sort of on members' minds about viability assessments at Bracknell Forest. So one of the questions is, do we too readily accept a viability assessment? And I think probably the point to make there is we are not experts in that area. The planning team aren't the experts, but we do seek expert advice to advise us on that. And so you will have seen, when you see a viability assessment, you will often see a report that goes alongside that from our advisors telling us, yes, it's robust, or no, it isn't, and these are the areas in which it's not. So that's one area. Is the process transparent? I think in the past, we've tended to have assessments that have come in and been assessed, but been kept kind of in the background because of kind of the commercial sensitivity that might be within them. that the government's been quite clear now that those need to be much more available for people to see. So a recent example, I think, for those on the planning committee, the site called Palm Hills and the viability assessment and the independent assessment were both made available on the public website, so people could see that and access it. And you know, how often do we have viability assessments? We've had about 9 viability assessments in the last 3 years, so that's on sites normally over 15 units. So it's probably about 5% of those kinds of applications. So it's not a big number, but depending on the size of those applications can have a big impact in terms of affordable housing delivery. So it is, although a small number, it's still fairly important numbers in terms of affordable housing units. So just finally, I've just some general considerations for members to think about before we move on to Andrew. So the local plan is tested for overall plan viability, and that's both through its preparation, but also at its examination. So when we look to submit our local plan later in the latter part of the sort of spring, early summer of this year, we will have a viability assessment within that, but that's not where it stops. Through the examination process, those viability assumptions are tested so that at the end, when an examiner says, okay, your plan's now ready to adopt, it should be in a position to be adoptable with a viable set of policies within it. Up-to-date policies aid the delivery of our plan requirements. So having an up-to-date plan with up-to-date policies in it that have been tested for viability puts you in a position where you are less likely to be receiving viability assessments, subject to there not being site-specific issues on sites that may not have been tested through the viability assessment. So not all scenarios can be tested through a viability assessment, but generally you would anticipate that the majority of your to come forward should be viable. And as I say, it's a small number of viability cases that we receive or deal with probably on an annual basis, but that's not to understate the fact that what it does take away is the delivery of affordable housing. So it is important that we make sure that we are robust in dealing with those. So those were just some quick slides, and I'm happy that those are shared. Kirsty's got those. I was just going to hand on to Andrew Jones from BPS. So Andrew's been working with the council for over a year now on viability related work. And I just thought if Andrew just gives you a little bit of a flavour of what he does, but also whether there's anything that we're doing that's unusual, or if there's anything that he knows that others are doing that we should be doing that might stimulate a bit of debate. So if I hand on to you, Andrew. If that's okay.
Okay. Well, just to give you a bit of background, I am by trade a chartered surveyor. As many of my friends say, what does that mean? It's well, there's fewer of us than there are vets, I was surprised to learn. We're basically valuers. That's what our role is in valuing land and property primarily. But there's also, I think most people are familiar with surveyors who survey the physical side of properties. I'm a fairly specialist surveyor in as much as I work primarily and almost exclusively in the development sphere and also exclusively with local authorities. So we work with about 70 local authorities across the southeast, but predominantly around London and the home counties. And we act for local planning authorities, primarily assessing major planning applications where issues of viability have been raised as grounds for non-compliance with the delivery of planning obligations like affordable housing. There are other elements to those contributions. You have a SIL as a borough, which Andrew's already explained is a non-negotiable contribution. But where you get major developments that contribute things like schools, and other pieces of major infrastructure, there is a negotiation about the degree of offset that might occur in those circumstances. So the bulk of my work, as I say, is related to major planning applications. We process in excess of 300 a year. So we're reasonably, I hope, up to speed on what goes in that regard. It is a relatively small world. There are a limited number of companies that we see on a regular basis. Not all of those companies are chartered surveyors. There's a mixture of people from different backgrounds. And the key things that we look for, aside from the more obvious considerations of what are schemes generating as value, what are their costs, are primarily issues to do with the site value itself at the point that the planning application is made. The aim of current planning policy is to ensure that it's based on the site without the benefit of the consent being sought, so that the uplift granted by the planning consent actually generates a surplus that is immediately captured for the public benefit. That's the aim of that exercise. And allied to that, there is an intention to limit developer profit aspirations so that any surpluses don't disappear in those directions. So in terms of the work I've been doing with the borough, it's been around the local plan. Now, the difference in approach is that we're using the same tools, the same basic valuation approach, which is called a residual valuation, which is essentially a very simple formula where you take all development costs from the anticipated development value, and what you're left with is a residual value, which you then compare to a site value or generic land value in the case of a local plan assessment, to see whether the scheme would be in surplus or deficit. So from the point of view of local plan testing, we've looked at a whole range of different sites that have come through the land allocations process, and we've modelled developments that accord with the plan policies. So there's a whole range of contributions, not just SIL, but strategic amenity land, and various other sustainability contributions, and to see in combination what level of affordable housing and other contributions schemes can bear. Now, it's important to understand at this point that sites vary, and you will know from your own SIL examination that you have lots of different levels of SIL around the borough, because lots of different parts of the borough have different economic dynamics. You know, the further you get towards Windsor, the higher the value. There's a bit of a cliff edge in some respects in values between the town centre and the hinterland. So obviously there's a need for a different approach across different sites, but the local plan has to set a policy target overall. And so what we're instructed through national planning guidance to do in terms of the preparation of the viability study is to look and see what a majority of sites can deliver, and then to look at that target being able to maximise delivery in relation to the need of the borough. So it's a stepped process. Not every site will be able to comply, but the intention is that the majority should, and that in the majority of circumstances, as Andrew said, there would not be a need for viability assessments. There should be a compliance with the plan. And I think in large part that reflects the considerable greenfield land supply that is coming through the land allocations process. So that's a fairly quick gallop through, but I noticed there are some questions, so I'll be quiet at this point.
Yeah, but we'll take the questions at the end, Andrew.
Thanks, Andrew. If I can hand over to Jim Bailey. So Jim works for Pegasus Planning. So Jim is based in Bracknell, so he knows the patch, and he's also got a background both in working for a developer, but also representing them for planning applications. So perhaps a little reflection on where the developers come from, if you like.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, I have been a town planner now for 35 years. I started at local authorities in Rushmore and next door to you guys in Wokingham. And I've sort of lived in and worked in the Bracknell area for many years. I'm currently working for Pegasus out of their Bracknell office. I spent a few years in the 90s working for Bryant Homes, based at Pope's Manor in Binfield. Some of you may remember that. And Pope's Manor is obviously still there. It's a listed building, and it was a fun place to work. And I'm currently working in Bracknell Town Centre, and I've worked in Bracknell Town Centre working for previous planning consultancies in the past. So a major part of my job is to work for house builders and landowners, developers, to help them to start off by looking at potential sites that they might be interested in buying, or taking an option on to buy later. And so when we look at those sites, we basically will look at what the planning policies say for that area. So for example, if it was a site in Bracknell, we'd have a look at the adopted Bracknell local plan, and we'd also have a look at the emerging local plan as well. And we'd look at what the policies were that applied to that particular site, and we'd advise the client on what the potential constraints and opportunities would be for that particular site. And one of the things that we would flag up would be things like the affordable housing requirement, the SIL requirement, those sort of things, so that they can look at the site and work out whether or not it's going to be viable, feasible to build their houses or their flats on that site. And sometimes, particularly we find with higher value sites, brownfield sites in town centres, which Andrew was alluding to earlier, do tend to have a higher existing use value. And if you obviously have to pay more for the land, you have to match the existing use value, and then you have to pay the landowner a bit extra on top to encourage him to sell to you for development. That obviously takes a big chunk out of the final value at the end of the development. So in some of those circumstances, we have instructed surveyors like Andrew to look at the viability question, to look at the existing use value and the uplift, and to look at the development costs, the costs of getting planning permission, the costs of building the houses, materials and labour and all the rest of it, and obviously the factoring in the profit margin at the end of the development, which obviously goes towards paying salaries for the people that work for the company and taxes to the government, etc. So it's an essential part of the development sort of funding. And then sometimes it happens that the figures don't quite add up. If you provide the 25 or 40% or 35% affordable housing that is required. So the surveyors that do the viability exercises for us, like Andrew, they'll look at that and say, look, it only works viability wise if you reduce the affordable housing from 25% to 15% or 5% or whatever it is. And then obviously we have to present that viability exercise with the application. The council will employ somebody like Andrew to look at it, and the surveyors will basically engage in a bit of a negotiation to agree who is right about the amount of affordable housing that should be provided as part of that development. So hopefully at the end of that process, it all gets agreed. The figures go into the Section 106 agreement, the planning permission gets issued, and everybody is happy at the end of that. So I've been involved in a few schemes like that, and we've tended to reach agreement with the local authorities at a local level. But I did have one in a London borough where we did end up having to go to appeal, and we obviously had to have those arguments about the figures in front of an inspector, and it was up to the inspector at the end of that to decide. So it can be quite a contentious issue, but it obviously is something that sometimes it is required, particularly in high value sort of town centre brownfield sites where sometimes the figures don't quite add up, and they need to be looked at in order to ensure that the viability of the development is correct. Otherwise, obviously, the development won't happen, and the much needed new homes won't come forward. So that's a sort of a little summary of my experience in this area of planning, and obviously I'm happy to take any questions that members may have.
Thank you, Jim. As I say, we'll take questions at the end. I think Andrew, the next speaker is Chris Turrell from your team.
Well, I don't know whether Chris was going to speak or whether he sort of encapsulates some stuff at the end. What do you say, Chris?
I'm happy to go with what the meeting wants. I mean, I notice a number of people want to ask questions and have been waiting for some time. So if people prefer to ask questions now, then that's fine by me.
Okay, thank you. In which case, let's move to the questions. And the first question is from Councillor Leake. If I can ask you in. Ian, are you there?
Hello?
Hello.
You can hear?
We can hear now, yes.
Excellent.
Your question, please.
Yes, I have a few simple questions for Andrew, if I may, Chairman, and thank you for your indulgence in letting me attend and speak. Andrew, can I ask you? You briefly mentioned the supplementary planning document relating to planning obligations. Am I correct in assuming that from what you say, that is going to be, it's intended to update that to correspond with the proposed new draft local plan?
Yeah, ultimately, I don't know if any of you remember, but when we did the SALP last time, so the last local plan, pretty much on the heels of the local plan, you then review your SIL, because you've got your new plan in place and there's likely to be new costs. So you'll go through the process of going through the SIL examination, and at the end of that, you'll have a new SPD, the supplementary planning document, which will set out the other obligations that aren't covered by SIL. So yes, at the end of the process, we would look to review both SIL and that SPD document, so that we've got a whole set of new policies. And
when you say the end of the process, the end of which process?
So at the end of once you've got your local plan, and it looks like you're going to get to an adoption of your local plan, you would be working through onto your SIL or SPD. And the end of the process would be an information on your SIL that says it's bound, and then you would publish your new SIL rate and your new SPD.
Okay. The reason I mention it, of course, is our current SPD still talks about 25% affordable housing.
Yeah, indeed. And so once you move to a new policy area, some of those things will become defunct because they're overtaken by the new local plan.
Okay, I'll leave that for the moment. There are obviously a number of issues about that. You mentioned when you talked about the decision of the local planning authority, did you, by using that expression, did you mean either the planning committee or officers under delegated powers, or either of them?
In the circumstances where you've got a viability assessment, you were essentially moving away from the policy framework, so it would always be a committee decision.
Fine. Okay. Again, when you talked about the viability, you said the viability in relation to the plan as a whole. Now, that's one thing. The issue obviously comes down, as you identified, in relation to a particular site or sites. And if it's a large site, then a very, very small change in viability on that site can affect the viability of the overall plan. How do you resolve those conflicting issues? Because on a piece of paper, with due respect, it's probably quite easy to say 35% affordable is viable across the whole plan. Delivering that in terms of specific planning applications is a completely different challenge, isn't it?
Yeah. So, yeah, I'll try and explain it, and Andrew Jones might want to jump in. So when you're doing your viability assessment for the whole plan, you're looking at what's the plan strategy and what are the types of sites that you're going to be taking forward. And your viability assessment is essentially looking at those types of sites. So let's, for instance, say you've got a lot of town centre sites, some greenfield sites, and those are your main typologies. You would do your viability assessment of the plan on that basis. So you would anticipate that the allocated parts of your plan would be easy to defend from a viability perspective. But there are lots of sites that then will come through the planning application process that aren't allocated, but happen to be in the settlement. So they are in principle acceptable, but they may have their own issues. So as I say, contamination or something like that. So on those ones, those much smaller sites, then you might get those sort of viability assessments. But on the bigger stuff, you should have probably, because the bigger stuff will have been assessed through your local plan, you should be reasonably comfortable that once you've got an up-to-date plan, the viability has been tested, that you've got sites that should come forward in a viable way.
My final question is, you made reference to the fixed costs of Sill and the Thames Valley Basin issue. Obviously, the borough has the opportunity to, after due process, fix the Sill cost. Who fixes the Thames Valley cost?
So the Thames Basin Heath, that's a local decision. So that's one we've agreed that what the figures are essentially to mitigate the impact. But that strategy is the only strategy that enables house building to take place in the Thames Basin Heath. That strategy is applied across 11 authorities, I think it is. But we locally have a decision about what it is, what the costs what the costs of that are to enable us to do that.
So we would have the opportunity to review that, would we?
Yeah, and we have done on a number of occasions. So yeah, we would be.
That's all for the moment. Thank you, Chairman.
Thank you. Next, Councillor Virgo.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman, very much. I've got a couple, 3 or 4 actually. It's a general thing. The first thing is, having sat on the planning committee, Andrew, as you know, we have seen some viability studies which, you know, are being thrown to us at the very last minute. I mean that absolutely. And they're usually about, I don't know, the last one I saw was about 40 pages of very intricate mathematics. And to be honest, you know, it's beyond me. I mean, I just think in basis, look, the developer bought the land. That's the policies of the council. If he can't supply the policies of the council, then he shouldn't have bought the land. I mean, that's what it seems to me, very straightforward on this. Just moving on to the next bit, I think that in terms of Bracknell Forest Borough Council, we should have someone, an officer within our council that reviews the viability studies. And the reason I say this is because, Andrew, you said that we've only had 5, but I would suggest to you that if we're asking for a bigger percentage of affordable homes, and we're not the only council. I mean, I've looked at with a reference to Andrew Jones, actually, because he made this point. Why don't you go and look at Haringey? Well, I did have a look at Haringey, and they've got very strong policies about affordability and so on. And obviously various sites, they have slightly different guidelines, but we will surely have more tests to affordable homes because we're asking for a bigger percentage of houses to be so-called affordable. And so therefore, the policies that make our policies work must be extremely robust. Now, we haven't seen those policies, therefore we're slightly in the dark here. But it seems to me that, you know, I was a little taken aback, Andrew, to be honest, by you saying, you know, we've got to have a plan that we've got to deliver the houses. It seems to me as a councillor that one of the great problems, and I hear this from residents all the time, that their children can't afford to live in the area near their parents because the cost of housing is gone through the roof. And part of that is because of the land values have gone up. And I guess going back to what you said, that the profit that a developer should make is between 15 and 20%, if I understood that. But it seems a very vague system, Andrew. And obviously what the councillors want and the planning committee wants is the policies to be achieved. So I just...
Question, Tony, question.
Well, there's loads of questions, Mr.
Yeah, there's lots of questions in there. Do you just want to break and let him come back to the ones you've read?
Okay, yeah, fine.
Shall I have a go?
Have a go.
Yeah. So in terms of the point about the viability of the whole plan being tested, so this is not something we've done before because viability is a newer thing. But the point I'm trying to make is that if you've got an adopted up-to-date local plan, you're in the best position to achieve the policies that are in that plan. So they will have been tested, and you would have tested those against that viability. So at least in the very early parts of that plan period, when you've got your new plan, you should have reasonable confidence that the policy could be achieved and should be achieved. In terms of your point about having someone in-house to sort of do those assessments, one of the reasons we haven't got someone to do that is because, as I say, we have relatively few of them, but also you will have heard Andrew say he's got experience of these across the piece in the southeast. So he's got a good understanding of the kinds of things that he's seeing in all of those different authorities as to how people are approaching and assessing those viability assessments. So you wouldn't get that if you had someone who was just located in the council. So we've always opted for that position to get someone who's an expert in their field to help us. And the final thing probably to say about the planning committee, I think one of the things that we need to do is the kind of exec summary stuff about the viability assessments, because for members making the decision, what they need to be aware of is whether the assessment is robust, whether it's been reviewed properly, and what the outcome of that is. And that could be done in a couple of sides of the report. That's not saying that they couldn't have access to the background information at all, but it would just give the decision maker the clear points in a sort of succinct form, if you like. So hopefully that helps with three of them, I think.
Well, you see, I must have a supplementary. You see, I don't quite agree with you, if I may say so. First of all, I think Bracknell Forest, as you explained, Andrew, is different to Haringey. Clearly it is. So we need someone specific that knows the area of Bracknell Forest. I'm not discounting Andrew's professional ability. I'm sure he's absolutely brilliant listening to it. But I think, it should be in-house because that's more expenditure from the council. And I do think, Andrew, this will come up more and more. It is inevitable. If we're going for a much bigger percentage of affordable homes, developers will find it extremely difficult to achieve. I'd also ask, if I may, I noticed Haringey that actually is asking in some places for 50% affordable houses. They are prepared to give a grant in some way. And the thing that I think that we should think about, we might be different than Haringey, but if we want to get affordable houses, we've really got to get into this, understand it, and be the leader of it, and make sure that we can deliver these houses and not accept just an affordability policy. Just one more thing, please, Mr. Chairman, bear with me. What the councillors want on the planning committee, in my view, as I sit on it with others, is not so much whether someone's reviewed it and accepted it. That's not really what I want, because I take that as a given, actually. But what I want is the basic understanding of what this means. And then I can argue or debate. And so the review has not got to be, I've reviewed it and it's fine, but, you know, the pure maths, which is not that difficult, as Jim has said, you know, on the idea of affordable houses, on the viability, cost of land, the total cost of the the production, the building, and so on, and the saleable of that, which has to be verified, and then you look at the profit margin. So it's not that difficult.
I think the slides that Andrew Jones provided for the member session, I think they're available. I think that gives you at least some of that, but we can pick up some of those points with Andrew at sort of outside of the meeting, and whether there's anything further we can do in terms of the kind of training front. So
I just want to protect us, actually. That's what I want to do. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for
So do we.
Thank you. Next up is Councillor McLean.
Thank you, Chairman. And can I thank the people who've spoken to us tonight for giving up their time to come along and provide their insight. But can I just prefix my remarks with the fact that I'm not a planner. I've never sat on the planning committee, and the intricacies of planning sometimes escape me. So if you could accept that, Chairman.
We'll accept.
My question is really in two parts. The first is, and forgive me if I've missed it, but what is the interaction between the rate of SIL and viability for developers, or isn't there any direct correlation between the level of SIL on a particular site and the then viability for development? And a sub question to that is, given there's talk about development in certain parts of the borough where development hasn't necessarily been considered before, do I understand that we get a chance to look at what level of SIL rate is applicable for those sites before any development can take place? So that's my first question, Chairman.
So in terms of SIL, the reason the government introduced SIL was so that developers have a clear idea of what the costs of development will be. So what the costs of the mitigations will be. So most developers will know when they purchase a site, right, okay, I can work out what the SIL for this site will be is X, Y, and Z. So they know that reasonably early on in the process. But that won't be the only cost. It will be the cost of the land. The Thames Basin Heaths is one of our things. So there are other interactions that factor into the viability. But yes, once we've got through our local planning examination, we would be looking to have a new set of SIL, and there's a whole process similar to the local plan to go through to approve what those SIL levels are. And as rightly said, we've got a variety of SIL levels depending on the types of localities and the value of the land. So in the northern parishes, it's a much higher SIL rate, and it's in Bracknell Town Centre, it's a 0 SIL rate at the moment. So that would all be reviewed as part of that process, if that helps.
Yeah, the question about viability, is there any direct correlation between this level of SIL set by a local authority?
Oh, sorry, yes, I see what you mean. Yes, so yeah, ultimately, when you've done your sort of viability work, you would look at setting the SIL level to ensure that the viability was achievable on those sites. Yes, you would, that's right.
Thank you. And then my second question, I suppose, is directed slightly more towards our guests, because I'm framing it in the context of the Court of Public Opinion. And clearly in 2018, we had the rather egregious example of Persimmon Homes and the directors' emoluments, to some degree based on the new homes bonus, perhaps. But I'm fully supportive of firms making profits, because that's the nature of what they do, and they generate dividends for pension funds and the like. But we are in an environment where firms are expected to engage much more in social responsible behaviour, And clearly I would link affordable houses with social responsibility. So I suppose my question is, in relation to developers who clearly have a business model that requires a certain degree of profit margin, how are developers these days looking at their business model and profit margin in the context of demonstrating public social responsibility, particularly where, in the case of affordable houses, there's a demonstrable need for those to be provided?
Andrew?
Well, first of all, there's quite a few things to unpack in that, really. The first thing to say is that obviously any business is going to follow where profit and return can be made. So if you're looking at the volume house builders, they're listed companies and they are competing for investor interest across a much broader spectrum of activities than simply house building. So people who are investing in those companies are looking for a return on their money, as you rightly say, and so they have to be competitive, leading edge companies to remain viable in that sense. And we should celebrate the developers that are capable of doing that, because they are not only picking up the private housing supply for the country, but they're picking up more than 60% of the affordable housing supply. And were they not effective and economic operators, that wouldn't be the case. Obviously, as I mentioned earlier in passing, the developers have to work within parameters on profit margins that are dictated by national planning guidance and to some extent by judgment within those parameters. And I would just say that if you were drawing a parallel to, say, AstraZeneca, who also have a public role at the moment that is in the forefront, no one is looking to cap their profit. Both Berkeley Homes, Carla Homes, whoever, are all paying their corporation tax, as are AstraZeneca, but they're also having to find out of their economics provision for meeting other public benefits, simply because land is a scarce resource. Now, I think it's worth remembering that. I sound very pro-developer on this. I only work for local authorities, but it's worth knowing that if you make life too difficult, they will go somewhere where it's easier. And at the end of the day, as I've said to many planning authorities, 5% is better than no percent. And therefore, you do have to be robust, but at the same time pragmatic in this process. So I would say, in terms of social responsibility, developers and persimmons haven't really set a very good example to people. But actually, if we can move away from a few individuals earning very high sums, that those organisations are actually delivering for us across the front that the government can't really afford to do on its own. And so probably should be celebrated. And it is a balance to not be simply knocking developers in this context.
Robert, have a supplementary?
We could get into debate about this, which I'm not prepared to do. I've had my questions answered. Thank you.
Thank you. Then we go to Councillor Badiga. Michael, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Thank you. Firstly, thank you to everybody that has presented tonight. Very informative. Can I just ask Andrew, when did we start publishing viability assessment publicly?
So I think it's only the most recent applications they've been on the public register. So I think some of the ones that were dealt with 2 or 3 years ago were just dealt with. They were presented to members, but outside of the public forum, because they contain sort of, exempt information at that particular point in time. But now they are essentially published as part of the planning register.
Is it this year, last year?
I'm going to guess. I presume it's in the last year or so, but I
okay.
Can't be here tonight. He would have known better than I do. So,
thank you. in your presentation, you stated that we've only had a small number of cases where viability or lack of viability has been used as an excuse not to deliver affordable housing. Are you able to just give me a guesstimate of roughly how many affordable housing has been lost due to this small number of cases?
No, I did try and find that out. I don't off the top of my head. I mean, the majority of those cases are smaller sites. They're not our large sites. They're not generally the sites that have come through the SALP. So they are smaller sites, not all, but most. So I think the numbers are reasonably on the small side, but that's not to say that it's, you know, still not an important amount of houses that we haven't delivered, you know, in terms of affordability.
I mean, I'll be grateful if you could just send that, but if I know it's a little bit technical, but
yeah, I mean, we can do a bit of a trawl back and have a look, but
yes,
wasn't available for tonight.
Thank you. With regards,
Michael, just
yes,
a sec, Mr. Bailey would like to come in and make a comment for you.
yes,
Please, Jim.
Yeah, it's not specifically on Michael's questions. I just wanted to impart some information to you. I've noticed in the last couple of years that we've been approached by a number of registered providers who are formerly called housing associations. So they basically own vast estates of thousands of what would have been called in the past council housing, and a lot of those housing associations, registered providers, have come about by taking on the estates of councils when they've given up their responsibility for them and they've taken them over. They're increasingly approaching us, and they are buying sites in competition with the big house builders. So they will buy a site where the policy compliance scheme would be 60% market housing and 40% affordable. Or if it was in Bracknell, it would be 75% market housing, 25% affordable, whatever the policy is for that local area. And then if they're obviously successful in buying the site and getting planning permission, they'll get the policy compliant planning permission, and then potentially they can build 100% affordable housing on there. And they can do that using government grants for converting market housing into affordable housing. So there are other ways that the system is providing more affordable housing to meet local needs. It's not purely the Section 106 elements of housing planning applications by the big house builders. So I just wanted to let you know about that, because I'm not sure if that's particularly common knowledge at the moment. The fact that registered providers are becoming much more proactive in the housing market, and they are turning sites that would have been market housing into more affordable homes. And I think that I certainly am, finding it refreshing to work for them, and to be delivering schemes that are going to be providing much more affordable housing for people in years to come.
Thank you, Jim. Michael, did you want to continue with another question?
yes. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Jim, for coming in there. Do we vet the independent assessors that we use to assess viability reports to ensure that the developers have not already contacted them? Because obviously, if developers can easily go to an assessor because it's an open business, the assessor could help them actually create a fantastic viability report to submit, and then that comes back to them to vet them.
Yeah, part of the reason for using the district valuer is because for that very reason. But as Andrew suggests, there are companies that work primarily or only for local authorities. And generally, when you're doing these kinds of pieces of work, if there's a conflict of interest, the companies normally would let you know. But we've used a district valuer who work for the public sector. So That was been our kind of our default position.
Okay, thank you. Should we, based on what I've heard this evening, should we be considering affordable or setting affordable housing requirement per site on the local plan now, instead of having a blanket?
I think it's really complex if you start doing that, because your viability assessment, you're trying to apply what you need in terms of affordable housing. So the affordable housing policy is about your need across the piece, and trying to get different levels on different sites makes it an extremely complex policy. So what you want to try and achieve is something that can be delivered in all circumstances, which is why most local authorities will have a single percentage that they apply. So yeah, I think I've not seen that done before, and I think it's unlikely to be very easy to test and probably not very achievable. So you're better off with a single policy approach.
But if that is the case, then when somebody submits or a developer submits a viability assessment or the need for one, surely it kind of goes against what you just said, because the reason why they would do that is because maybe the site, as you've actually indicated in your presentation, they found something else or it's not big enough to do that. So we're going to end up doing it anyway.
Well, I think it'll come down to the individual site, but it's essentially because that's the only area that's not fixed in terms of a cost. So affordable housing is the thing that's not fixed by, like SIL and some of the other contributions I've talked about before. What we're saying about doing a local plan viability assessment from the outset is that you test all of the types of sites that you'd expect to see come forward within your plan and check that they are largely viable. And in doing that, you once you've got your up-to-date policies and up-to-date plan, you should be in quite a strong position to defend those policies. But the government does allow this ability to put in a viability assessment if there are some extenuating circumstances that mean a particular site might find it more difficult than another to make a profit. And so they would put that viability assessment in. But your new plan with up-to-date policies is your best protection, if you like.
Okay, can I just, because
last one, Michael. There's people
sorry?
queuing up. Can you make this the last question at the moment, please? Because
okay, I'll make it. Yeah, sorry. My last question for now is that I'm reading everywhere I've read so far in terms of the planning guidelines and everything else. It says under no circumstances would the price paid for the land be a relevant consideration in the viability assessment. That is not what I heard I've heard so far this evening. Am I reading it wrong on the government website?
Perhaps Andrew Jones might like to just come in on that.
Yes, this comes back to how you test viability. Essentially, you look at the development proposal, you work out what the proposal will be worth when it's completed being built, from which you then take all the costs associated with that development except land value, but you also take from it developer profit. And what's left is a residual value. You then compare that to what's called a target land value or benchmark land value, which is guided by national planning policy, which relates to the existing use of the site. And that's because planning obligations are in the main funded by the uplift in value conferred at the point consent is granted. So if, for example, you had a dilapidated office building, perhaps worth £1 million, but that once planning consent had been granted, it might be worth, say, £2 million on that residual assessment. That would leave you £1 million available for contributions towards SIL and other planning obligations, but also affordable housing. So that philosophy is set out in the National Planning Policy Guidance, which is statutory guidance that we have to follow both in plan making and in decision making. So at every step, a compliant assessment would always reference that guidance. So price paid would not come into that exercise.
Okay.
Thank you, Andrew. I will come back if there's time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Michael. Thank you. Next is Councillor Tullett. Malcolm.
Yes, thank you, Chairman. I did have some questions that followed on from Councillor McLean, who also started off by saying he's not on planning and doesn't know a lot about it, but it raised an issue in my head. What we're looking at is a question, and it is, are current planning practices robust enough to protect Bracknell Forest from developers manipulating the viability study process? So in coming back to that, could someone just confirm first, before I sort of get to the nub of the question, right? This thing is about assessing the development market to establish whether or not something is worth doing rather than being doable. Is that right?
I'm not sure who's going to be able to answer you there, Malcolm. Andrew Hunter?
I don't mind.
It's slightly different to that. I think it's a willing developer wants to bring forward a development, and in doing so, they need to make a profit. And essentially, the viability assessment is about them being able to do that, so that you meet the needs for your locality. So you need housing. You want developers to come forward to bring forward a site. They would assess that site, and then they say, well, actually, I'd like to bring that site forward, but I can't because of X, Y, and Z. And here's my viability assessment.
Right. So it is about whether it's worth doing, not whether it's doable.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So it's got nothing to do with can it be done. Is there enough profit in it for me to do it? That's the bottom line to a viability study. Is that right?
Well, ultimately, yeah.
Right.
The government's accepted that developers need to make a profit, and in doing so, there may be at times they need to prove viability to do that.
Right. Okay. So the next bit, which is where Councillor McLean came in, was asking about infrastructure levy, and I'm going to expand that into infrastructure itself. So obviously, the infrastructure levy is a fixed percentage of a particular allocation. I think it was residual value we're talking about. But with regards to, there's been so many, I'm getting really confused. It's quite a technical issue, and as I say, I'm not on planning, so do excuse me, please. But my concern was the question that started this off, and it's about developers manipulating the viability study process. So what I'm hearing is that they can play around, okay, with how things like Section 106 and affordable housing is used to determine whether or not there's enough profit in it for them. So if that's the case, where are we falling down right now? Why is I don't know how the question came about. It's obviously come about by someone that's involved in planning, but I'd like to know what sits behind the question in a way, and whether or not we have already got developers that are manipulating the viability study process to gain more profit at our residents' expense.
So I'll try, Andrew, James, or Jim might want to come in, but ultimately there are fixed costs with development. So you know, land purchase, all of that kind of stuff. SIL is a rate that we've agreed as a council, and that's a per square metre rate. And so that's non-negotiable. If a development for X amount of square metres, you times it by the figure and that's what they pay. And there are certain other obligations that are non-negotiable, so Thames Basin Heaths. And since viability has been part of the planning process, so it wasn't part of the planning process originally, it's a more recent thing. The main area that gets left where there's some development viability issues is the difference between the provision of the affordable housing percentage, because you get less money for an affordable unit than you do for a private sale unit, and that's where the offset in the viability is. The point about manipulation, I think it's that members, you know, obviously are keen to achieve the policy compliance of a site. So 25% affordable housing, members would like to see that delivered. But there is this ability within government guidance for developers where they don't think that they will make a reasonable profit on that site to use that offset of the negotiable bit on the affordable housing to make a viability argument. So it's, I don't know if that's explained it very well, it's quite complex, but
it is really complex, and that's probably why I'm not on planning. What I'm trying to get my head around a very simple sort of question, but the answers always make things worse.
Sorry.
No, it's not your fault. It's everybody that's saying things at the present moment, and everybody that knows what they're talking about seems to just confuse the issue for me. So I'm trying to keep it simple in my own mind. I think I'm trying to say, is there room for manoeuvre from the developers to play us at our own game with regards to it's like a balloon. If you squeeze it in one side, it'll pop out another. So if we say we want 50% affordable housing, basically what you're saying is we won't get any developers to take any interest in that anyway, unless we've got registered social landlords who will probably go for the 100%. But if we've got private investors, they won't want any of it. And then is there a balancing act between the two? I'm getting really confused. I am confused.
Andrew Jones might be better at answering than me.
As I say, if there weren't a certain amount of debate on this subject, I wouldn't be here. I would probably be doing something differently somewhere else. I think it's worth just actually looking at the sort of the background to why viability has come into the planning process, because I think that in part answers some of your questions. There used to be a
really simply though, please, really simply.
Very simply, that there has been since the Second World War a house building programme by local authorities to develop social housing in their areas. Over time, that has diminished to a trickle to almost a dead halt. Although I have to say, in just the last handful of years, a number of authorities are coming back into that market. But the reason they were stopped was political, because affordable housing was a power base for some authorities, and for politics, that wasn't necessarily a good thing because it predetermined voting direction. We then had right to buy, which was Margaret Thatcher's idea about changing voters' intentions, but it's been supported by not just Conservatives but Labour administrations, and it has gone on as a very successful policy. But what it has also done is reduce the supply of affordable housing, and at the same time it's also reduced the money in affordable housing. So the source of affordable housing has to come from somewhere, and government can't afford or won't afford to fund all of it. And equally, without controlling part of the land supply, it has to come from developers. Now, there is no one hard and fast fixed sum, because it's not like income tax. There's not an easy threshold to set. So inevitably, where you have some room for manoeuvre and you can affect the outcome as a developer, there will be debate about some of the inputs. Is it really going to be as valuable as you say? Is it going to be really as profitable? Those are areas that we debate as a matter of course. And I would be totally wrong to say that that doesn't result in sometimes disagreement. Ultimately, as decision makers, the authority can choose to give weight to that viability assessment. If they see an advisor for the authority saying one thing and the developer's advisor saying another, ultimately it's the decision makers to take a view as to where the truth lies in that exercise. But in my experience, the vast majority of cases, as I say, we deal with more than 300 a year. I deal with perhaps a dozen appeals a year. So in the rest of those cases, the bulk agreement is reached because the professional developers know where it's at. It's the small guys, the mixed use developers, the one-offs where we have the problems, who don't understand policy.
On that last point then, I'll be very quick. On that very last point that you've just made, which sort of sums it all up, can you suggest to us how, forget the second part of the question and decide whether or not recommendations are made to the executive. Can you suggest to us 1, 2 or 3 recommendations that we can make that will stop developers manipulating the viability study process for our robust planning processes and policies? Can you actually make some suggestions so that we can think about that moving forward, please?
It comes back to your policies. National guidance, if you like, provides a framework, but many authorities have within that framework adopted policies in line, obviously, with that framework, but you're entitled as a planning authority to develop your themes through supplementary guidance, which is, well, you have to start with a local plan. You have to have policies. So there is a staging in this game. But then once you've got those policies, you can develop guidance to developers that deal with some of the nuances that national guidance leaves open. I won't go into the detail of it, but
I think I'm done, Chair. I don't think I can take this any further, Chair. I'm completely
okay. Okay. What we'll do, we'll then move on to Councillor Temperton.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, everybody. I'm not a planner in any way at all, so my questions will be very basic. Can you have, if registered landlords will give 100% affordable homes, can we encourage registered landlords? Are we allowed to go out there and say, you could have first option on this site, you can do this, or does it have to be open market and everybody in competition? Can you go out and have friends of Bracknell that will produce what we want?
I mean, like any developer, they're competing for land. So, unless someone's gifting them land, they've got to find the land. But we have consented 100% affordable housing schemes. So, the site next door to the offices at Times Square, was 100% affordable on that site.
But have we given them first option? That's what I'm really saying.
Well, you can only do that if you're a landowner. So, right. Ultimately, they are like a normal private body. They are bidding on sites to try and get sites to develop. So they might use their own sites that they're redeveloping.
Can I also ask them, once it's going and all this is done, if somebody says they're going to build 40 affordable houses, do they have to build 40 affordable houses? And do we ever have any control over whether those 40 affordable houses are built at the beginning of the development, or do they have to all wait to the end?
So it depends upon the site. So some sites are built in one phase. So you'd expect the affordable housing and the normal market housing to be built all together on very large scale developments. So let's take Jennings Park as an example that that will have brought forward phases of affordable housing at certain triggers, and that was featured in the Section 106 agreement.
And what happens to the viability agreements then when those affordable houses are still not built, like 12 years on Jennings Park? Do we go back and can we challenge them?
So if the housing is already got a planning approval, then they would have to come in and do a new planning approval if they felt that it was no longer viable. So they wouldn't implement the plan that they've already got in place. And at that point, they would have to make their viability argument if there was one.
Okay, so they could get out of it really at that stage.
Well, only if there was. I mean, I think on an existing site that they already in their ownership is probably unlikely, but each case on its own merits would be the approach.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Anybody got a question who hasn't already asked a question? I'm not seeing anything on the chat, but I just want to make sure you feel you've got the opportunity.
Can I just come in here? It's Dorothy. I couldn't get on the chat thing. It wasn't working quite right. I just want to have something clarified by Andrew. At the very beginning, Andrew, you mentioned a site. You know which one I'm talking about, Arm Hill. And you said it was on the website now? Because as you know, there was a lot of controversy about that site with the paperwork and the viability paperwork being available to councillors on the night of the planning meeting. Are you telling me now that it's on that site? Because I'm in the process of doing some work on the, as you know.
Yeah, my understanding is that that's on the planning register. So yeah, it should be up there. If you can't find it, let me know.
Yes, but when did it go up?
I'd have to check. I don't know. I'd have to check.
Because the viability of that site, of the amount of those properties and what was there is detrimental. Thank you. Thank you, Robert. Thank you. It's Councillor Hayes. Sorry about that.
Okay, thank you. Conscious of just the rest of the agenda, I think I've got a question from Councillor Virgo and a question from Councillor Badibo, and then I think we'll conclude it. It would have had a fair innings. So can you make the questions shorter than perhaps some of the other debates we've had, please?
Shall I go first? Mr. Chairman. Andrew Jones, I wonder if I could ask you a question, actually. In the viability study that you get, when you look at the cost of building, can you have a say in that? For instance, let me give you an instance. If, for instance, there is a particular one the previous council was talking about, but if there is a huge lot of work to do on the site, can you say something about it and scrutinise it? And I know that the late Tony Pidgley, in the conversations that we had together, miss him very much actually. However, he always said that one of the things is that, of course, bigger house builders can go to much more factory orientated construction methods, and they can produce a house much cheaper. Therefore, the profit would be greater and they can afford more affordable houses, if you see what I mean. And therefore, they wouldn't need the viability. But do you have any say in that, Andrew? Or do you have
Oh, very much. It's one of the areas that we scrutinise. I keep two firms of quantity surveyors busy practically full time. They're 98% working for me all the time, and I use, there are reference points you can go to for costs, but they use them as well. But we use case studies, we use their experience. There's a variety of things, and as you say, we know that the bigger house builders can build a lot more cheaply than some of the national indices, for example. One of the things you've got to remember, though, in planning is that it's not personal to the developer. So we can look at a scheme and say, yeah, that's a big developer kind of scheme, and we would expect a big developer to do this. But we couldn't say, oh, Barclays undercut the market by 15%, whereas everyone else is 7%. It's got to be an impersonal process. But yes, it's all part of the challenge, very much so.
But if you were looking at something that cost a lot of money to do something else in the construction of the land, you could scrutinise that and say, well, we don't think it should cost you that much.
Oh, very much. I mean, okay. If you take, for example, remediation of contaminated sites, there's government grants.
That's what I was talking about, funny enough.
Yeah, well, there's government grants that actually allow developers to offset the cost of that remediation against their corporation tax from a range of 100 to 150% of the cost of that remediation. So we take that into account. Also, it depends on the source of that contamination, if you like, because there is a principle called polluter pays. And if you've got a landowner who's been abusing, if you like, their land for years, pouring toxic chemicals into it, and it's going to cost a lot to clean up, then that should be reflected in their site value. And a lot of these principles are set out in national guidance. So it isn't just us knowing about it. These are a set of rules that we work to, and it's a common set of rules.
Great. I'm very grateful. Thanks, Andrew.
Okay. Thank you. Michael?
Thank you, Chairman.
Can you make it brief?
Yes, I will. Okay, there's no minimum or maximum profit to be made, stated in the guidelines. The figures that are submitted for the viability assessment, once the development is complete, do we go back and assess those?
No, we wouldn't do that.
So because they could sit on the land for like 2 years and all of a sudden all those figures are gone out of the window because house prices are gone up.
Well, once the permission is granted, the permission is granted. Obviously, if they didn't start their permission within the given time period, then they would have to reapply. And if circumstances had changed, then you would reassess the viability if they made that case again. But once a permission is granted, then you've granted it on the basis of the information that was before you at the determination date.
Thank you. Just my main concern and why we're here today, I believe, is about affordable housing or delivering affordable housing. I'm not really, the viability thing is just part of that, but we have to give weight to the viability report. What I don't understand, can we give zero?
Michael, please, can you get to the question?
I am. Do you mind? I don't. Question. I asked a question before you interrupted me. I said, could we give zero weight to a viability report?
Right, Andrew, can you answer that, please?
If I don't think you could give a zero weight to it if it was a robust assessment. If the assessment was robust and it fell in line with national guidance, then we would have to take that into consideration in making a determination. So it would be one of the material considerations that you would make in terms of determining that application.
Okay, Andrew.
Thank you.
I may ask the question to you, and it comes back to the agenda. In a word, are our current planning practices robust enough? Yes, in your opinion? Can't hear you.
Sorry. Yes or no? I think there's room for improvement in some of the, so making things more transparent, I think is an area in which we want to do more on. I think the giving members confidence of the people that we're using to assess the viability assessments would be also, I think we could do a bit more about that and get people introduced to members on that. Something around the point that Tony was making about giving shorter but clearer steer on the viability issues, the key ones, so that members have got that before them when they make determinations. But I think probably the practices, are reasonably robust. I think they've got better over time, but we need to just make sure that that's more transparent, I would say.
Do we expect to see some changes when we have a new local plan? Those policies.
When we have a new local plan, we would hope to not see so many viability assessments because we will have an up-to-date local plan with tested policies. But I think, as I say, the government guidance is clear that this is still open to developers, but I think we'll be in a stronger position with an up-to-date plan.
Okay, thank you. And I think one final question, Councillor McLean.
The question is, in as much as clearly this isn't a motion, so there isn't a session of questions and debate, but are we as members going to have the opportunity within the overview and scrutiny panel to discuss what we've heard tonight? Because I think there are some important points to come out. And so that's my question to you. But I think my final question to Andrew Hunter would be, following on from your question, Chairman, we as members need to be as confident as we possibly can in the plans that come forward to us in terms of the deliverability and also the delivery of affordable housing. And you've gone some way, Andrew, to tell us what you think needs to happen in order to give us that confidence. But clearly, as members, are you sure that the steps you've outlined will give us the confidence we need to make the decisions to demonstrate to our residents that we are doing our utmost to deliver on the council's policies?
I'd hope so, but I think we're on a journey on this one. So the first session that Bob mentioned at the start of the meeting, so the session that Andrew Jones did, I think that was a good starting point for that. I think Tony's point about wanting to understand it in more detail, and that's probably not for everyone, but those on the planning committee, I think there's something we need to do about that to build confidence. And also my point about the people we use to do those assessments, so that you get confidence that they are the right people.
Thank you. I think coming back to the other question to me was, would we have the opportunity in overview and scrutiny? I would certainly like to think that we would be invited to consider and to comment on the views in any revised new local plan as part of, if nothing else, the consultation process. If it wasn't the consultation process, then I think we could certainly call it and have it before us with all the revised wording. So yeah, I would hope that we wouldn't have to do it that way. I would hope that we would be invited to consider it under scrutiny of the commission, so everybody would get the opportunity. I don't know whether that answers the question, but it was certainly, I'm on the lines of your thinking, and the answer I would say would be yes. Can I just finally, first of all on speakers, Councillor Turrell, do you wish to come in on the debate?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I'd just like to, well, first I'd like to thank our all our presenters, because I think that the material that they've given to the meeting, I think has been helpful, and also thanks for the many questions. It is a subject of considerable interest, and I think the root of it is the short answer to the question posed by this item is no, and the reason is because of the age of some of our planning policy documents, and we do need to bring up to date the suite of documents as you go through it. The site allocations local plan was adopted in 2013, the core strategy in 2008, and we have saved policies from the Bracknell Forest Borough local plan of 2002. In planning terms, that's a considerable, those documents are of considerable age. There has been much movement on national policy, the introduction of national planning policy guidance in 2012, and its revisions in 2018, 2019, and you know, further revisions in prospect. We've also seen how the issue of affordable housing has come up the political agenda, not least because an increasing proportion of the electorate really have to struggle to get on the property ladder. And that's why it featured so prominently in the manifestos of all the main political parties in the elections of 2015, 2017 and 2019. All of those, all the parties made pledges to build considerable numbers of houses. So getting, as Andrew Hunter commented in his presentation, an up-to-date local plan is our best defence in this, because the considerable scrutiny that all parts of the plan go under, and a key part of the plans are the strategic sites, means that the challenge has been all round. The inspector the examiner will look at what the local planning authority has put forward. The local planning authority has itself looked at the sites to see what they can take and when it can come forward. Developers will have a view on that, which may not be the same as the local planning authority, and local residents will have a view which may be yet another view. I think where an issue like viability becomes a particular bugbear is the further you get away from when a plan is adopted, the more events take over. The credit crunch of 2008-9 was mentioned. I think 2020 might be quite an interesting one in terms of maybe we should, I think people perhaps will place rather more value on key workers and the need to make sure that they're properly supported and properly helped on, especially when if there's an issue in getting onto the property ladder. So I think it's been a very useful session. The clear thing, what we must do now is to take forward the new local plan, get a new local plan adopted. We do that by going through the procedures set down by law. The stage that we're at is that the submission version will come forward to go out to consultation and then examination. That's not the first consultation on the local plan. It is an important document. The issues, I think, the other issues around affordable housing is, of course, that we operate in a market. It's been mentioned, if you do set the percentage too high, developers will, or if the process is considered more arduous than other local authorities, you do run the risk of developers holding back on developing their sites. That is an environment that we have to live with, and we can make representations to government on it. But the key thing is for us is getting the policy documents right, the local plan, then looking at the SIL levels. Our SIL is a tariff. Section 106 is around here is important because of the SPA. That's one of the main reasons for having it. As was mentioned in the presentations, we do have control over that. And very recently, in the last couple of years, we did raise the contributions from that, and that was an important thing to do. So, I mean, I would thank the presenters and thank the questioners for all the questions, and I think that's been a very useful session. Thank you.
Chris, if I may, in your planning for the consultation, have you got plans to invite the commissioners to comment? After all,
everyone
out of the 12 councillors that are actually on this commission, 7 of them are actually on the planning committee.
The commission would be perfectly welcome to make a submission on the consultation. The consultation on the submission plan, the responses will go to the examiner to be considered. We've gone through earlier stages where the consultations came to the council. They would now go to the examiner, but they will all be looked at, believe me. So it's well worth getting down the representations and making a point of putting in a representation to that consultation.
Thank you very much. Just in conclusion, we have conclusions, and we've spoken about those and what people have thought, and thank everybody for their contribution. The next on the agenda, of course, it says conclusions and recommendations. Now, I don't know whether any member has a recommendation to put forward.
Can I put something forward, Mr. Chairman? I put it on the screen, actually. I don't know if members want to contribute or suggest something else, but may I read it? The Commission requires a specific policy relating to viability, and the Commission requires to scrutinise it before it is published. End motion.
Okay, have a seconder? Well, for the purpose of debate, I will second that for you. Would you like to?
Chair, if I could just pick up a point in terms of that motion.
Mm-hmm.
General form, it would be asking the executive to do something. So using a few words in terms of that, it's looking like an executive decision, whereas the Commission is making recommendations to the executive. So I don't know if that could be rephrased in some way.
Mr. Chairman, I would like to challenge that thought. I mean, all we're asking for really is to scrutinise. We're not going to change anything. We wish to scrutinise it, and that's what this meeting was all about.
As I said, Chair, that's just in terms of that would be the normal form, but clearly members can make any decision that they choose to make.
Okay, any other member wish to speak or
Chairman,
review? Councillor McLean?
Thank you. Just a point of process, really. And this goes back to my long-held view that the Commission and the panels are there to help the Council make better decisions. And of course, as we all know, it's overview and scrutiny. Overview of decisions to be taken and scrutiny of decisions that have been taken. But I suppose my question to Kevin as our Chief Officer is there any reason why the Commission can't make recommendations to Council? Does it have to be a recommendation for the Executive to consider? Is there anything stopping us putting forward our views before the Executive gets into a position to have a decision to take? Because I just want to be clear about that.
Chair, just in terms of answering that question, absolutely the Commission can make clear recommendations in terms of how it thinks the Council should go forward. The form in terms of to the Executive, it would be for the Executive to implement those recommendations, but I'm simply saying in terms of form. But yes, if you came up with 4 points, it would be these are our findings from this session, and then if you wanted something done with those, you can either make a recommendation to the Council or to the Executive, but in normal form you would make the recommendation to the Executive.
Okay, Kevin, thank you for that.
The real problem, Mr. Chairman, with this is that we haven't got the wording. So we can't make any recommendations.
No.
We got the wording. We're in the dark. That's why I tried to put something whereby we need to see it before it's published, which I don't think is unfair, frankly.
I think what you're asking as well is a policy relating purely to viability in this wording.
Yes.
Scrutinise a policy relating to viability.
Can I help, Chairman?
Well, let me just get an answer so I understand what.
Absolutely, that's what it refers to. Yeah.
Is that what you're trying to achieve, Danny? That's the thrust, isn't it?
Absolutely, the thrust, Mr. Chairman. Yes.
Okay, Councillor Leake.
If I can help, Chairman, as you know, I was the Commission Chairman for 8 years, and based on my experience and some knowledge of the Council Constitution, the motion that Councillor Virgo has proposed is perfectly correct. The Commission can ask, it can do a number of things. It can certainly ask for a policy to be drawn up and provided. It can consider that policy, and it can then go on to recommend that policy or any such amendments as it thinks fit to the Executive. So it has that dual function, and in that respect, it is carrying out its overview function as provided by the Constitution. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for that contribution. Any other member wish to speak? Okay.
Just a question from me, Michael Badebo. Who is this addressed to? Who is going to deliver this? It says the Commission requires a specific policy relating to viability. Who's going to deliver it?
That would be direct to the Executive member, in my opinion.
Well, Chairman, no, isn't this motion to Council in effect in whatever direction it takes through the Council's channels? This is a motion, and I could be wrong because I'm not going to speak for Councillor Virgo, but isn't this a motion that will result in the Council having suitable policies to reflect what we've been discussing tonight?
Well, I would hope so, yes.
Absolutely, absolutely. Yeah. The Council have to answer the question, don't they?
Then should we just say we need to add the Council there as the person? Or
Chair, if I could just come in again just to support members in that. So I think Councillor Leake was talking about two processes. There's one that the Commission can, in effect, review it itself, so it can in effect, launch a review, ask for some information to come back to itself, and then consider that. And then there's a second process, which is then, having made its findings, it can make recommendations too. And so the question I originally raised was, and I think members have said, there's a bit missing to this in terms of who's being directed to do what.
Okay. Well,
can I speak, Mr. Chairman?
Sorry.
The Commission requires a specific policy. Well, the policy has got to come from the Council. There's no one else that can do a specific policy in this regard. We can certainly put Council in it. I'm not against that. But clearly we're the Commission. We're not the people making the policy. It's the executives making the policy. The Council enact it. But the Council at the moment are the agents to come up with the policy for the executives in which to enact. So the Commission requires a specific policy, refers to the Council, because the Council offices are working on this policy. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Can I just take advice, a comment? Andrew Hunter, are you there?
Yep.
Andrew, can I just ask you, in terms of a specific policy on viability, where would that be written?
So I'm not entirely sure, because we take our advice on viability from the government standpoint. So the government's policy is quite clear on when and how you apply viability assessments. But within the local plan, there will be reference to that. So there is some there would be some reference to viability assessment as a process. I'm not entirely sure what a policy would add to that. So,
okay,
I think I'm not entirely sure that with a local plan, the government's guidance is that you don't include lots of stuff in there that's already covered by national policy. So the national policy is quite clear on when you apply for a viability assessment and the kinds of things that you need to consider. So we would only be reiterating those points, because there's no local dimension that we would add to that policy. So I'm not sure that a policy specifically would be of particular use.
Mr. Chairman, can I come in?
Yeah. I mean, we're in debate, but I'm going to have to relax that, because I think we're getting ourselves into a bit of a hole here that people are uncertain. So by all means, yeah.
Andrew Jones, as I understand it, made it very clear in the first meeting, which really helped us on this meeting tremendously, that every council, in fact, it was Haringey that had a specific policy on viability, because they were not achieving the affordable houses, as he explained, as I understood his presentation. And therefore, that policy, which is tapped this afternoon, to be honest, was accepted in the Greater London Council because it's down on their website. And obviously, there are different bits which apply to different councils, as Andrew's explained in the presentation, because we don't want all of that. We might need specific bits of it. So when I said policy, I meant to a draft wording, or however the officers want to put to the council, of protecting us when it comes to viability studies. That's really it, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. I think
would it help to amplify that comment at all?
Please.
To be specific, and it goes back to the fact that the policies are nationally set, but there is scope within your local policy, the local plan, to develop supplementary planning guidance. So that is, if you like, a more detailed statement as to how you interpret national policies. And that's what I'm specifically looking at. So it's not a new policy, it is more guidance, and it covers things like the form of assessment, what you expect a developer to submit, things of that nature. It's much more about the mechanics of the assessment to make sure that, and there are gaps in national guidance, how you as a borough interpret those gaps.
Okay.
So should I change policy to guidance?
That sounds helpful to me.
That sounds better.
Happy to do that, to get us
Yeah,
up.
happy to accept it, Tony.
Okay.
I'm not sure there's any further debate other than to put this motion to the vote. Sorry, Mary, you haven't spoken.
Thank you very much. I would just like to say that in one of the things that Andrew Jones did say, he was asked, were there specific things that he could put forward that would help us make our policies more robust and to enable us to get more affordable houses? And he said, yes, there were. So I think that would be very important to include in this specific policy so that we could look at that and not in reinventing the wheel, but looking what other councils are doing that is enabling them.
So that's policy or guidance? That would
the guidance.
Guidance. So let's move on. And does anybody wish to vote against the motion rather than going through everybody's individually? Is there anybody, if you indicate on the chat for me, please, that you would not support the policy of guidance relating to viability, as Tony mentioned in his recommendation? I'm seeing nothing on the chat, so I'm taking it everybody is in agreement. So we will move on. Thank you for that. Can I thank everybody as well on behalf of the Commission for taking part and helping us through this overview and scrutiny, which has been very interesting to say the least. And I'm pretty sure we won't see or hear the last of this subject. Thank you, everybody. Move on to item 7. This is to consider the draft apprentices review report prepared by the Education Skills and Growth Overview and Scrutiny panel. The chairman of that panel is Councillor Jill Birch. Jill, would you like to present your report?
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you very much indeed. Before I start, I'd just like to say that because of COVID, obviously we had some challenges, but I was very ably supported, and the panel was supported by Emma Young, who really did go the extra mile as far as I'm concerned. And I'd like to actually draw everybody's attention to the very end of the report, because it's where I say my thanks. And I have a paragraph there saying, I'd like to thank the Vice Chair, Councillor Brossard, for his support, and all the councillors. And I actually put it a bit differently because it was their thoughts and ideas, because I've obviously done quite a few of these reports and reviews, but I felt that the people that took part this time really contributed so much of their knowledge. You know, Councillor Dudley, he brought in the fire service, and we were able to have them along as one of the people to tell us about apprenticeships. A lot of people, Councillor Gore, she had a lot of expertise and she was able to add value with her knowledge. And also all of the councillors that took part, and there were 10 of them and 3 executive members, they actually formed, when we had our last two meetings, they actually did the recommendations between them. Nobody did it and presented it. Everybody looked at the wording and changed it until everybody in the panel was happy. So I've got to say, I think this was a real working together, a real example of that. I've got just a few slides just to go through a few points. I won't take up too much time because we've obviously had a long meeting. So Kirsty very kindly is going to start that off. Our key findings, it was really important that we learned about developing existing staff, not just young people. There I've got a perception problem, because people on the right of this slide, you can see intermediate, equivalent to GCSEs, to advanced, to higher, and to degree. There are so many levels now of apprenticeships to actually bring on staff, which actually on the council we do. We have a lot of people right from 16 joining us, but also in their mid 50s to late 50s, actually being our apprentices. And I think this is something that was really very interesting. So I think that we all think that they're just for people just leaving school, but that's not true. And also the actual added value of the skills that people can learn. Also businesses, we found that there was a problem with accessing funding and knowledge about whether they were eligible. And the biggest barrier, though, seemed to be matching up businesses and apprentices. But we did find very good practice by BFC and partners, and the recommendations came from this. Can I have the second one, Kirsty, please? So local businesses, how can we help? What did we find out that we could help with? The barriers were, during COVID particularly, working from home meant that staff couldn't be supported as much. With lots of businesses, especially the small, medium businesses, they actually found that it was difficult to have enough time to support apprentices. And they needed support to understand the process, how to apply for funding. And we found that there was a lot of confusion about amount of paperwork and how much monitoring. The solutions, partnership working to encourage information sharing, and a mentoring scheme was promoted. Can I have the next one? So apprentices, how can we help? What can we do on the borough? The barrier was apprentices needed to find their own employers. And in fact, there's lots of online websites, and people just have to go on there and see if they can find actually what they're looking for. Also, there was a perception gap. People think that they're lower paid, but actually a lot of apprentices, if they go through the higher levels particularly, their pay was comparable and really advanced their careers. So I think that there's a lot of perception gap that needs to be actually made sure that people understand that it's an advantage sometimes to be an apprentice. So the annual apprenticeship fair couldn't take place that we normally do from the borough. Information could be hard to find in lots of places, and coronavirus had really impacted vacancies 25% lower. So our solution was a video talking to businesses and apprentices, which could be shared, and the council websites updated. Next one, please. So this comes to the recommendations. And as I said, I was really pleased that these came from businesses, business partnerships, and it came particularly from members. The executive works with apprenticeship pathway providers to ensure that our young people aged between 16 and 21 have the best opportunities and outcomes. Now, this one hasn't got a date on because it isn't something you can put a finite date on, but a lot of the others do actually have an outcome date. Number 2 was the executive adopts an apprenticeship policy that sets out expectations, pay, terms and conditions. And this should be completed by December 2021. And that we should actually look at this. 3 was the executive promotes apprenticeships externally and internally by a promotional video. And this is to be done by March 2022. We made that slightly longer because of actually the COVID. We felt that it would be more difficult to arrange that. The next one, please. So recommendation 4, that the executive reviews the current apprenticeship web pages and updates the content to include more information. And we found lots of different job vacancy websites for information for apprenticeships all over the place. And we felt it'd be better to put them in one place. So that's what we're actually hoping to do by December. recommendation 5, the executive investigates whether it will be possible to facilitate actually, sorry, I can't see my screen there, a mentoring scheme between large businesses and small, medium businesses to encourage more apprenticeship opportunities by March 2022. So this was actually by the business partnership. They actually suggested this would be a really good thing. And that the executive, the last one is number 6, the executive develops ongoing partnerships across Berkshire to provide a united gateway of support and guidances to businesses, enabling them to take better advantages of the apprenticeship levy. Now, this is because it came out of when we talked to businesses that actually there is untapped amount. And actually, I put that in the introduction, is how much money is not actually used. So the big businesses have actually spare apprenticeship levy that they can actually give to smaller businesses to enable them to go ahead with actually having an apprenticeship. So I think there was lots of things we learned about it. I think it was a really positive review to do. And I think it was really worthwhile. I certainly learned a lot, and I know everybody that took part did. And I would say that we use the same format that we did for our last review. And I think that works really well, starting with the recommendations and then thanking everybody at the end who took part. And it was very ably supported by Emma. And this was a short review because we only started it on November the 23rd. And our meeting on January the 26th, which was the last full meeting, was where we finalised all the recommendations. So I feel that we really have done this quite quickly. So I would recommend it to you all, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jill. Members, do you have any questions? Councillor Virgo?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Sorry, I haven't got my video on. Here we go. Thanks for the presentation, Jill. A couple of questions. It really interests me when I was reading it, actually. I think you put in the report that schools weren't really aware of apprenticeships. I was actually shocked by that statement, frankly. I mean,
there was, yeah, some of them still are not. It's
shocking, Jill. It's shocking.
It is getting better, but one particular school in our borough is very good and very proactive. Another one is also, but some of them, although they go to the annual apprenticeship fair, they're not really as linked as we would like. And we did approach all the schools and we have got some replies, but not all of them replied. And I think this is because traditionally, a lot of teachers, they went to university and it's still almost looked down on apprenticeships. I think that understood that actually there is a lot of money to be saved by not having great debt and then actually out of it. And we had some comparative figures where people that went to university, actually when they came out, they were earning less than the apprentices. And I think that's where one of the misconceptions, I think we need to do more work on that.
A long time ago, this Berkshire County Council, before the unitaries, I remember because I went to Willing County Secondary, they used to have a careers officer, and that careers officer taught two of the schools. And it needs someone really to go in there and give people some, focus on what's available to them in life. That's what I think.
The problem is that the responsibility for this is now within the schools. So actually, we do more than a lot of boroughs by actually putting on an apprenticeship fair, a careers fair. And but I still think there's a lot more we can do. So hopefully, if we can get a site on the website, if we can get a proper video, if we can do this mentoring, and do that. I think that.
Can I ask how you were going to do the mentoring, how that works? How do you propose that would work?
Well, I was hoping that we would get somebody with an education to take on that role.
Right. Okay. And then 2 of the schools.
And they have not said so far. I'll find out when I go to executive, which is March the 2nd. So that's quite quickly, to see whether they accept it. And if they do, then I am hoping that we will bring this forward a bit more.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
55, we have 55 apprentices at the moment. They were brilliant at answering all the questions of the survey, and it gave us a lot of good information.
Thank you. Councillor Tullett, you have a question?
Yes, please. Thank you, Chairman. Jill, there's a lot of work gone into this. There's a lot of information, as you just said. This is just an observation more than anything else. It's with regards to the recommendations themselves in a general way. Please don't take this as derogatory. I'm honestly meaning this as a suggestion. The actual recommendations, as I'm reading them, do not sound as if they can be, or I'll rephrase it, they sound as if they can be got out of quite easily. I'll look at the first one. Executive works with apprenticeship pathways providers to ensure our young people have the best opportunities. There's some very vague words in that. I'm hoping perhaps you can beef up these recommendations to specific, measurable, or smart recommendations. I mean, from my perspective, the executive or an executive member will already be working with the apprenticeship pathways. We in fact heard, you and I both, from the executive member responsible that he was actually working with the pathways at the present moment. So that one's easily addressed, because the response can be, well, I'm already doing that. And things like have the best opportunities and outcomes. Well, again, we all want that, but I don't see anything specific in that. I can go on, but I won't.
No. We decided, we talked long and hard about this one. We had it as the first one as being aspirational. This is what we would want, but it is not, you're quite right, has no date on it, because I don't think it's something you can put a date on. So
that's not quite what I mean, Jill. That's not quite what I mean. What I'm saying is that the recommendations for me, and I'm quite happy to be in a minority on this one, but for me, they're not specific. They're not smart recommendations. And I don't mean they're not smart as in not clever. I mean, they're not smart as in specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time-based. A lot of them have got timescales in there, but I don't feel personally they fit in with the idea of smart recommendations personally. So if you're going to make a recommendation, I mean, another one, for instance, if you don't mind me saying so, this is the fifth one, that the executive investigates whether it is possible to facilitate a mentoring scheme.
Yeah.
I would have preferred it if you said something like the investigate, implement a mentoring scheme. That now, it's a recommendation. They don't have to adopt it, but there's too many ifs, ands, and buts in the recommendation from my perspective. But the actual recommendations themselves, in essence, are great. I just don't think they're robust enough for the executive to get to grips with. They're a bit wishy-washy for me. That's all, Jill. I think
I think you know, everybody, you're quite right to make a comment, and that's important, because that's actually what we're here for, is to discuss it. I will just say that some of these are with outside partners, and you cannot actually say to an outside partners that this has got to happen, because we cannot insist on that. So
okay, I'll leave it there, Chair. Thank you very much. It was just
okay. Thank you.
So, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. Can Mark, you have a question?
Thank you, Chair. Really, just speaking as representing secondary schools, the government has absolutely recognised that this is very important now, and through the Ofsted inspection and the Gatsby framework, all schools have to make sure that they have got robust plans and policies, and it's reviewed, and also trustees and governors are charged with making sure that they actually inspect these. So there is actually a two-pronged approach now to actually make sure that young people, whilst they're in school, are supported, because that's the only part of it that you can support them when they're in school. Once they've left school and they're looking for apprenticeships, that's another challenge, but definitely within schools. And I have to say, with not just the schools that I deal with in this local authority, but other schools, there is a much greater emphasis today on apprenticeships. And I think the point that the educators themselves went to university and that's all they focus on, I don't believe that is like that anymore. And so I would just like to say that the schools are actually doing something about this, whether they want to or not. They will get picked up on it.
Mark, you make a very good point, and you're quite right. But I'm just saying what we found, that they're still lagging behind. Yep. Definitely one school was completely on board and had policies, and we saw, you know, they aren't, from the questions they answered, it was completely obvious that they were completely committed to it, but that isn't the case everywhere.
No.
And we had that evidence from a webinar, we had that evidence from the replies or non-replies from some schools. And so that was obvious, but you're quite right. And it is moving forward at a pace, and it will be. And it will be even more important now, I think, because of all the disruption in education. I think will never be as important as at the moment, with all the problems that young people have had with taking exams and exam results. I think it will be absolutely at the forefront of all schools now. But before Christmas, when we wrote to them and we asked about the survey, I'm just reporting on what we found.
No, fine.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? I'm not seeing anything in the chat indicating. Jill, thank you. I found it a very interesting report to read, and all the contributors. We are asked to review the report for submission to the executive. Is there any member wishes not to support this going to the executive? I'm not seeing any indication in the chat. Therefore, I'm going to conclude that everybody is content with that. So thank you. Thank you, Jill. And thank you to the panel.
Very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Very good. Move on to item 8, which is the work programme update. First of all, can I ask Kevin Gibb? Kevin, you got any comments on the programme?
Yes, Chair. I've just got a couple of slides that the team have asked me to talk through, just to set the scene for the chairs doing their updates. So, Kirsty, if you could just poke my slides up. Of course, we might have lost Kirsty.
You slid off.
Thank you. If we can advance a slide. So just in terms of reminding members as the Statutory Scrutiny Officer in terms of what was agreed in terms of work programme resourcing principles. And we've drifted a little away from those. Primarily, I think we over the summer weren't able to conduct the panel work that we wanted to do, and in catching up, we've started condensing and seeing a number of work programmes starting to fall over each other. And in many respects, actually, the work coming out of them is the quality has stayed exactly the same. So I really just bring to the panel's attention that first principle, which was we would do one review at a time, so that we could encourage as many members to participate in each review rather than finding that they're pulled between reviews. Clearly, each review takes a significant amount of preparation and activity before and during the meetings. Clearly, when we do these one-off scrutiny reviews, as we've done at the Commission today, you can see that we take considerable amount of time to get that together, and getting a good set of witnesses absolutely makes it a really good process. So just again, just reassuring members that we put that effort in, but that is a constraint in terms of our resources. And I think what we've also found in terms of my review with chairs is that once people get into their reviews, actually they're finding more and interesting directions to go. And that sometimes is actually meaning that reviews are longer than they were originally scheduled by the Commission. But actually are worth going that extra mile because they're actually coming up some really good recommendations and getting some really good, seeing some really good pieces of work that they're able to comment upon. But it does mean that that has the impact on another panel's work, given our first thing of not trying to do too many things at the same time. And so I would just ask the Commission to carefully consider those impacts when agreeing changes to the work programme which are being suggested. Kirsty, next slide, please. There's obviously interdependencies, and I think I've just covered this one off in terms of the Education Skills and Growth panel has now delivered 2 reviews, and they've got SEAL coming up and need to be some adjusting timing because obviously the local plan is coming through from the planning department, and we really need them to get that piece of work through. But actually we still want to make sure that that SEAL review has proper attention. The Environment and Communities has been working on the social registered landlords, and we've been hearing about that today. That's impacting on the food waste review, although by the COVID impact on terms of the implementation of food waste, which is 1st of March, has played to that. But there is a concern in terms of the Blue Badge review, although it is now anticipated to start in April. And in terms of wellbeing and finance, again, the issues in terms of its impact on the Blue Badge review and how we make sure that's scoped, again, it's now looking like we've got a number of reviews starting in April. So we would just ask the Commission to take that into account in terms of its decision making. Next slide, please. So just as a slide on a page, which I'm not going to talk through because I'm sure that the Commission chairs will pick up the detail. It's just starting to see how, in terms of Q1, we're seeing 3 reviews happening pretty much in the same window. And we'd actually tried to make sure that we had different reviews in different quarters. So it's just looking forward and seeing if there's any adjustment to the programme that the Commission would want to consider in light of its original principles. I think that's me done. So Kirsty, if you want to take down the slide, and Chair, I hand it back to you and the chairs to do their oral updates.
Thank you, Kevin. Can I ask, first of all, if anybody's got any questions to you? Any member?
Yes,
Chair,
please.
Right. Jill? Yes, Jill.
Oh, thanks very much. Sorry. Yeah, Kevin, I still can't quite understand why. I know that we're going through the plan, but I don't understand why that stops us doing about the SIL, because the SIL has already been set by council, and we're just looking at how the money's been spent, and that's the scope of it. So we've started preparing a scoping document. I don't understand why we can't go ahead with it.
Chair, I'm rather than saying not go ahead with the SIL, it's just really drawing the Commission's attention to that there's 3 reviews now scheduled in the same window of time. And obviously that's one resource pressure in terms of democratic services. The only consideration I would have in terms of SIL is in terms of your scoping, and I think we've had this conversation as a commission before, who your witnesses are. Clearly, if they're not pulling in council officers, then you're more likely to be able to go ahead more quickly. But if there's council officers involved, it's just looking to see how they're scheduled in terms of time. So, for instance, today's meeting, officers felt it was better to do that early because they knew that they would be in consultation on the local plan in March, April. So we just need to be, it's mindful of those 2 aspects.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think
Councillor Templeton,
are you next up?
Me, Mary Templeton, did you say?
Yeah,
yes, I'd like to ask a question, please.
Yeah.
As far as I'm concerned, and I've been on several of these workers, I don't think any of the members are complaining. So my question is, do we not have the capacity within the council to let this review and this scrutiny go forward effectively? Because to be honest, I think what's coming out is really good and it's worthwhile and it's looking at what we're doing. But if we have to delay it all because we haven't got enough officers, then perhaps we should look at the capacity that's available for members to do their work.
Okay, thank you. Do you want to comment on that, Kevin?
So Chair, it was the fact that when we did our resource plan, it was against the work programme which was put forward, and we resourced it on 1 review at a time. And now we've got multiple reviews going on at the same time. We are coping, but it's creaking around the edges. And obviously, officers are under increased pressure in terms of COVID and work situations. So it's just bringing it to the Commission's attention as one of the factors that we'd hope you consider as you look at your work programme going forward.
Okay, thank you. John Poulter, you got a comment?
Yes, please, Chair. So I was going to bring this up during my presentation for the food waste. I've just going to latch on to Kevin's last comment there about creaking around the edges. So can Kevin please answer my query as to last week there was a member update on the food waste launch, and your officer, Damien James, during that meeting stated that the review of the launch of food waste would be added to the scope of our food waste for HMOs and flats, ad hoc, with no consultation with myself as chair of that review, and also, in my opinion, far too early for us to actually properly assess the effectiveness of the launch and whether it's actually delivered on all of its objectives. So I'm just wondering, you're telling us that we're under strain, but why are your officers going ad hoc and making false promises to members?
Yeah, Chair, I was slightly surprised by that question and answer myself, because the question came from a commission member asking an officer who wasn't really in the loop to be able to answer it. So I think, you know, almost coming back to the point of the commission needs to pick the timing that it thinks is appropriate. And John, as the chair, I think you need to pick a point where it's appropriate, and then we'll look to see how we resource that review. It did feel like we were asking the waste team when was the best time to do that, and they were given a date, but I think you need to consider that yourself. I think you've already agreed your scope. It's now that the timings have moved about, I think you need to pick a date, and that's really about bringing the work programme back to the commission today to actually say, when do you think it's best, and how do you balance all of the different reviews in terms of some have got absolute deadlines in terms of they have to be delivered on a certain date, but others can float a bit. Can we do something about that shuffle just to make sure that we can fully resource and make sure everyone has the best opportunity to get the best reviews out the door? We have delivered an awful lot of reviews this year, so it's just a consideration of, as we plough forward, how do we make sure we do that in the most effective way?
Chair, can I just come back on that, please?
Yep.
The officer that made the comment last week is an experienced officer. So I would have expected that officer to know the total protocol. So I was a bit surprised and taken back by his comments and his promises.
As I said, Chair, I think that they gave a date, but ultimately the date is in the hands of the Commission and then in the panel chair rather than the other way round. So, yeah, that would be my position on that.
Okay, thank you. Isabel, you have a question?
We were recently faced with a situation on wellbeing and finance that one of our supporting officer was going to be moved to somewhere else in the middle of an investigation. And I think, can we please have a reassurance that the support officer is there for the duration, please?
Chair, we make every endeavour to make that happen, but obviously employees have different needs at different points in time. So we obviously have to accommodate as a good employer if there's an issue. Sometimes we're not able to, as employers, disseminate information widely in terms of why certain things have to happen. But hopefully members will be assured that our general principle is that each review has a review manager attached to it for the duration of that review, and they see that all the way through as one piece of work. And that's the most effective way I think we can do that.
I hope you're right. Thank you.
Any other questions to Kevin? And we'll move on. If I ask for the updates, perhaps John, can you give an update from your panel?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. We actually had a meeting on Monday for the registered social landlords review. We've got to the stage now whereby we've drafted our recommendations. We're just putting a little bit more meat on the bone for the recommendations, and we're ensuring that all of those recommendations are smart recommendations. It's been a fantastic review. We've gone into a lot of detail. And my colleagues on the review panel have been fantastic, very engaging and willing to ask serious questions. And we've gone back to the RSLs quite a few times with further questions. So it's been a very in-depth review. So, looking forward to the report being presented to this commission in April. And then we've just done the scope for the food waste for flats and houses in multiple occupation. If I can just draw members' attention to, on the scope where it says objectives and scope, on the first 3 bullet points, we've omitted the word flats, but we won't be ignoring the flats. They will be part of our main focus. So if anybody thinks that we're ducking out of flats, we're not. It was just the omission of the word flats, unfortunately, but it is at the top and it is at the bottom. So we will be most looking into flats and HMOs.
Thank you. Moving on, and Malcolm. Malcolm.
I was expecting it to be Jill next, sorry. Right, I have, if you don't mind, I'd like to just share something that I thought was going to be on the agenda initially. So I'll just share this particular page, which just gives you the what was going to be an update slide. We were due for completion on social isolation and loneliness in April 2021, where it says where it says on target. We're actually in some respects ahead of schedule because we had no choice but to disengage with public health and adult social care. for obvious reasons. The meetings of Berkshire Healthcare Foundation Trust and the Clinical Commissioning Group were also put back, but they're also due to take place fairly soon, and we have dates in the diary for those. We have had a really useful, engaging process with members of the community, and Bobby Mulher actually gave us an excellent presentation with regards to digital inclusion and the digital deficit, which was actually reported in the newspaper, and also the executive member responsible gave an interview as well, although that was more to do with libraries. But again, the whole thing was coming together. This is due for completion within the next couple of weeks, and will be coming forward to the next commission meeting, which would have been next month had it not been cancelled, but is now being put off to April. So in coming back to it, I'm going to stop sharing that now. How do I stop sharing? Right. Oh, someone's done it for me. Oh, right. Okay. Thank you for that. I didn't even have to touch anything. It just happened. So that's the situation as to where we are with the current review. We obviously have not been able to liaise and interview witnesses, those on the front line of the COVID response, which is a shame, but we have got a hell of a lot of information from the people that are there. And with the ones that are coming up, including two of our own councillors as well, I think the report is virtually there. There's a lot of recommendations already in the pot, and they will go some way towards helping with isolation and loneliness, I think, across the piece. Coming back to, again, something that Kevin was talking about with regards to member support, with regard to another one, and I'm going to share another screen as well. If you can just hold on 1 second. I'm just trying to share screen, and it is that one. Right, so I'll just share that. If anybody wants to move that around, I'm just going to move it down. Right, I had an interview with an officer with regards to developing a scope for something that I actually put forward to both yourself, Chair, and the Vice Chair, Tony. And I had nearly an hour's interview with the officer. And when I asked why it wasn't on the agenda, I was told that she'd been told that it wasn't to happen. So I did it myself. Basically, this could take place fairly quickly. There are a number of reasons why this should be considered. And it's not just a review. This is proper scrutiny. This is the situation where, for a number of reasons, which are the reason for, and I've called it a review, but this isn't just task and finish as such. It'll be a very quick task and finish. We think we can do this in a very short period of time, and I already have members of the panel that have shown an interest in starting this process very quickly. This arises initially from the social isolation and loneliness review with regards to people that cannot get out because they haven't got the ability to. This is both before and after COVID. This is a continuing issue. If they're stuck in their house because they can't get a blue badge to park up and feel that they can't go somewhere, that in effect is actually forcing them to stay at home. So there is a direct link with social isolation and loneliness. The primary legislation was actually brought out to help those with hidden disabilities, and we're ending up with a different outcome to that. There's had ombudsman involvement. The Local Government Association has also been involved. The statement is that the protocols have followed, but the appeal process was criticised, since been improved. Those improved processes need to be monitored, but it looks like if they're coming up with the same outcome, then we're not learning a lot. And more, in some respects, as equally important, the local media are involved, and they've made comparisons with other councils, and Bracknell Forest Council comes out at the lowest end. they're 16th highest in the disparity figures, which is quite disconcerting, and there's a reputational issue. So we've set out a very quick set of, this could be a quick hit. And basically when we come to the end of the isolation and loneliness, this could fit the gap between now and the April meeting. And with a bit of luck, we could even get 2 reports on the table by that meeting. There's a number of questions that need to be asked. The way we're going to do it is we will interview the relevant witnesses. We have already got offers to do that, including those affected. There's a possibility of consulting with other local authorities at both ends of the scheme, those that have done it well, those that have done it not so well. And this could be desktop reviews, particularly looking at the comparisons between the intentions of the legislators and what we're actually doing for internal processes. We're looking to basically only need the services of one Democratic Services officer, probably for an initial period, and the Blue Badge officer. It'll be obviously run by myself. I'm making the application. We'll do it for the April deadline. We think we can actually get it done very quickly. This is more to do with scrutiny in a way. This is about decisions previously made rather than a task and finish. There is a potential for unintended discrimination and obviously enforced isolation and loneliness. So there are equality issues involved. There are likely to be financial and legal implications, but as far as climate change is concerned, we won't know that until we actually start to look at it. So basically what I'm asking for is permission from the Commission to actually set this in motion before the start date of April. What we're suggesting from every single person that I've spoken to, and I'm happy to, if any, I can again stop share. So I'll take that down now. I'm happy to take any questions at the present moment, but at the end of the day, I think what I would really look for is all of the commissioners to actually provide approval to go ahead with that. Thank you.
Does any member have a question to Malcolm on this?
I have. I've got my hand up, I think.
Yep.
Well, it's really endorsing what Malcolm has said. I am very aware of people who have had a blue badge for some time and with every justification, and they were turned down, which led the families to incredible distress, and they were eventually restored. That was totally unnecessary because there's no justification for the refusal in the first place. And I think we have to stop this in future.
Thank you. Does any member have anything else to say, or are you all content to let this scope be their next piece of work? I take it as nothing's coming up in the chat, that everybody is content. Okay, thank you.
If that's the case, could I just ask Kevin if that we can now make sure that with the ending of the isolation and loneliness review, at least the first part of it, can we now have access to the officer that was originally placed with us a month early, please?
Chair, I have to take that away and see. I haven't got the resourcing plan in front of me. I will see what we can do.
Okay.
The only reason I asked that, Kevin, is because we've already had an engagement with the young lady concerned, and she already made a start and basically was told to stop. So I'd like to actually get her to re-engage, if that's at all possible, please.
Yeah, obviously, if she was allocated onto another review, we need to be able to see if we can get that review pushed back if the Commission wants to prioritise this over something else. So, but as I said, I don't have the resourcing plan in front of me, so I couldn't give that undertaking. But if the Commission says it is a priority, then we will juggle the resources round. But that just means that if we take from one area, we give to one area, we have to take away from another. But as I said, we're keen to do what members would want us to prioritise.
Well, with respect, Chair, we have already made a start with this officer, and not the last thing I think any of us want to do is to remove resources from someone else, albeit that, as my vice chair has mentioned, we've already had someone taken away from us partway through and allocated to someone else. So I just think that in terms of fairness, we need to be able to be given our head and go. And if that's not the case, then I'm sure from the feelings of the members of the panel, we'll do it ourselves.
Okay, thank you. I think in terms of approving the scope, there was nobody opposed to that from the Commission. I think the resource issue, perhaps you can have when Kevin has had a look at his resource, you can have a conversation tomorrow. Yep.
More than happy, Chair.
Okay, thank you. Moving on, Jill, could you give us your update, please?
Thank you, Chairman. Obviously, we've got the apprenticeship review going to executive on March the 2nd. So that's really gone through. And we've already scoped, actually, the SIL, but I actually was going to have ask permission for us to get on with that, even though we're not having a meeting till April. So at least we start and get on and sort of organise who, because we have actually started it and I could have shared it with you tonight. I didn't think of doing that. So I would like to get permission, between now and April to actually get on with that scope and to start fleshing out what we're going to do. So
could I suggest that that you talk, it's a resource again, isn't it? If you could talk through the resource and then give us your scoping document, even if it's by email.
Okay.
As we can see, and then if any member wishes to oppose or otherwise or have a question, then we can get that out. But otherwise, it's a resource and timing thing, isn't it?
It is, yeah. And I don't want to take it from anybody else.
No,
for sure. Yes, so if I can email that to you, that'd be great. So if I could do it early next week and email it round to everybody, because it is ready, but
have a conversation with Kevin first on the resource. Okay. Make sure you've got something supporting.
I will do. Thank you very much.
Do that first.
I'm also going to ask something else, and that is that the care leavers review, which we did early last year, that did have some recommendations, and at the 1st of the 2nd, 2021, there are actually 4 of them which were due to be done in February this year. So I would like you to put on the agenda for us to just look at where we are with that and whether it's the April one or the one after. But I do think it should be quite soon that Commission, can we actually have an update about that?
Well, we can put that on the agenda for the April meeting. Officers can note that now.
Thank you very much. That's all I have to say. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Councillor Virgo, if we go back to when we were accepting the minutes of the last Commission meeting, there was a recommendation in there from climate change. Are you there, Tony?
I am. I'm just waiting for you to finish.
Oh, okay. Right. What I'd like to do is just hand over to you. And
okay. Thanks.
You've been sharing it very well.
Yeah, I didn't want to speak too long because I know it's quite late this the hour. But I think what's really exciting is that climate change is really racing through at the moment. I don't know if people have seen the news, but Ford and Jaguar Land Rover are only going to make electric vehicles from 2030. Yeah. And if anyone's watched the weather, the polar vortex is sitting over Texas and Oklahoma to give them temperatures of minus 22 degrees. So that's just unheard of, which they think is down to climate change. So going back to this, I know members are really keen, and I think we all are. And the last meeting certainly showed it because we had lots of executives on it and lots of people wanted to speak. And I'm really grateful for those people who did and helped on that. So thank you very much. So to take your points, Mr. Chairman, the leader has agreed to form a board for climate change. Call it a board, call it a panel, whatever we want to call it, I guess. And I know, just listening to Kevin, actually, I know the model for this board has to be still shaped a little, and resources and so on, and we need to sort of think it through carefully. But nevertheless, it's really exciting. I think I've suggested some members to go on this board, Mr. Chairman, because it's, if you remember, we talked about cross-party, because that was really important that we get the Liberals and the Labour Party involved, because there's no politics in this, really, to be honest. And also I try to get some backbenchers as well who were really keen to do this, because they should have a go at suggesting. One of the things which I think members should be aware of is that if we set this up properly, it's not just about those members, and there's 8 members altogether, but it's also about other people coming in to give advice, you know, the parish councils, experts in the field, etc. And this, of course, it is not some opposition to the council, but it's to endorse Kevin's policies and build on them, because we all know we've got to go on and introduce new stuff as technology changes, and believe me, I think it's changing enormously quickly. So I could put to you, Mr. Chairman, the people on the committee, which I quite like endorsed, and then we can move on to the next stage of formulating the committee and giving it some governance.
By all means, would you like to?
Can I just go through these names if that?
Yeah.
Members are okay with that? So I put myself on this board. Councillor Tullett, Councillor Temperton, and Mary might want to speak. Councillor Mossam, Councillor Parker, of course, from the Liberals. Councillor Mackenzie, Councillor Sandra Ingham, and lastly, Councillor Tina Mackenzie Boyle. I've also tried really to kind of choose different bits of the borough so that we're not all one-sided. You know, there's a fair kind of pool of people representing their wards. So I don't want to say a lot more at this point, Mr. Chairman. If you accept that and members are happy with that, I'm quite happy to fade away.
Thank you, Tony. Any questions? Are members recalling the recommendation that a climate change steering group be formed to include non-executive members and cross-party representation and report regularly to the Commission? Any questions?
Can I speak? Okay.
Yes, Mary.
I think the important thing we've got going, and it won't end after 1 year. And I think there's so many webinars now, and we're getting so passionate about it that I'm delighted to be asked to be on this. And I think all of us must get so involved, because what the council's doing is all right, but we've got to move at pace. And I think this will move it forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. Any other comments from members? No? Then Tony, can I thank you for your work in this climate change area? Because I know it's been quite intense. It's not going to be a short, sharp, like Malcolm was just talking about, come back with a report in April. This is going on for years. But
it's a career, isn't it?
Yeah, yeah. But thank you for your work in getting aboard and talking to these people to make sure that they're serious about taking part, committing to it, because it is important. Does any member not support this, or indeed have a question to Tony? I'm seeing nothing, so I'm taking it that you're all content and supportive. Thank you very much. Well, I've got to say that's, as far as my papers show, the end of the meeting. Can I thank you all for your attendance and your indulgence, because I know it's long, but I do like to give people the opportunity of expressing their thoughts on these things, and particularly tonight was very, very deep. next meeting is on the 7th of April for the Commission. So can I thank everybody for their time, efforts and energy, and have a good evening. Thank you.
Chairman. Good night.
Thanks, Mr.
Good
Chairman.
night.
Chair.
Thank you.